the purpose of what I want to examine, which is what the South Korean government leader, what the South Korean leadership looked like, the actions that they took against their own population, claiming that they were fucking communist sympathizers. It's oversimplified. That's it. Skip directly to World War II, then skip directly to the invasion from the north, skipping over the entire background of the conflict. Yeah. I mean, it also has, I don't even think that this is like hyper biased or anything. I'm not even going to say that. It just more so skips cultural context because it has very limited time. And if you go all the way back to the development of Korea, but then you skip over even like Japanese colonialization and the resistance movement against such things. Like there's a lot that goes into like understanding the like the historical context that goes into understanding contemporary South Korean society. Like if you look at this and you think, oh well, it's the big bad North backed by the USSR that like simply invaded South Korea without and assume that like every single person was like violently against allegiances to even socialism, you fail to understand why the South Korean leadership executed so many people, specifically because they did not want to have any sort of contentious, any sort of unification. They did not want any sort of resistance against their dictatorship, and how beneficial this was for America's interests in creating a bulwark against growing communism in the region. There's always this like monolithizing of both our foreign adversaries and also monolithizing of our foreign allies as well. The understanding that like trade unionist movements, feminist movements, like movements that were socially progressive were regarded as pro-USSR and violently squashed in South Korea. And I think that plays a big role in how you arrive at the current Korean political system that is basically also another version of the duopoly that we see in the United States of America, with a relatively right-wing liberal party and also a somewhat more right-wing, further right-wing liberal party. This is the reason why when you see labor militancy, you don't actually have, even if there is labor militancy, you don't actually personally have some kind of result or any sort of like political group that you can lean on to demonstrate your interests. And I think that it's important to understand how the ownership of the South Korean economy virtually exchanged hands and went from authoritarian rule to a neoliberal rule that dictated that 6 families virtually own the entirety of the Korean economy. These very wealthy families. So all of that, I think, plays a role in any sort of protest movement, in the examination of any sort of protest movement and where it goes, and how it plays a very formative role in the way that South Koreans, especially young South Koreans, view the existence of South Korea as a living hell, because all of that plays a role in having a lot of these societal harms left unaddressed. Mr. Beat has openly stated how he's against American imperialist actions against popular communist movements. I want chat to know that. Yeah, I don't know what his political background is at all. I'm not making assertions about his political ideology. I'm simply stating that it is this was relatively reductive because he has 22 minutes to explain this complex subject matter, and I think it would be more interesting to just look at it from a hyper-specific perspective. Just like look at why the DPRK resents America from the lens of like the Korean War, for example. That's what it was. That's the reason why I was gonna click away from it. Not because I have any issues with Mr. Beat whatsoever.
That ultimately resulted in the deaths of around 5 million people, including a larger proportional civilian death toll than World War II. The war was indeed devastating and displaced millions of Koreans. The Soviet Union and China aided North Korea, and the United States and several other United Nations countries aided South Korea. It ended basically in a stalemate with an armistice and that DMZ I was talking about earlier. Technically speaking, the Korean War never ended, and I can tell you you, even though the armistice was signed 68 years ago, the war is still fresh in the minds of both North Koreans and South Koreans. For the first few decades after the war ended, both countries had authoritarian regimes. However, in South Korea, the people ultimately didn't put up with it. Until the 1980s, South Korea had much political turmoil and instability. However, since 1987,
I know it was the wrong video. I went back to it. I wanna show you this.
June democracy movement, South Korea has had a competitive electoral system and a fairly stable government. North Korea has had a stable government since the war, but has successfully kept the authoritarianism. Meanwhile, economically, both countries did fairly well in the decades following the war. South Korea liberalized its economy, becoming more market-based, and for 40 years saw huge economic growth. In fact, some even called it the miracle on the Han River. Both were admitted into the United Nations in 1991, but it was around that time that things went to crap for North Korea. After the Soviet Union collapsed, they lost a bunch of aid, and their economy sharply declined.
And a massive fucking embargo that continuously starved the North Korean population. A lot of people don't know that. Yeah, I mean, there's so many aspects of this that are not mentioned. Like, North Korea was an industrial powerhouse for Korea overall, and that North Korea was virtually destroyed. I believe, what is it, like 70% of all standing civilian infrastructure was destroyed. The American bombing campaigns, and even the American bombing campaigns, and even the potential chemical weapons, chemical warfare, biological warfare that they engaged in, with all of the information that they had gotten from Japanese war criminals that they did not prosecute, so that they could get this information. Specifically, the research that was taken from the Japanese imperial actions in Manchuria and many other places, Unit 731, was utilized in North Korea in the hands of the American military and also all of the other allied nations. And in spite of that, North Korean development early on was pretty good early on. But a lot of Americans and a lot of people just generally don't know that, partially because of how diminished voices that are in the crosshairs of American empire are, but also partially because, I mean, they were in the orbit of the USSR, and mainstream media at the time was infinitely more centralized, and most people don't know that. Most significantly, however, everything that you know about North Korea is the post-famine North Korea. Okay? In the aftermath of the USSR collapsing, America was the victor of the Cold War. Capitalism won. Socialism lost. Okay? For many different reasons. I'm not going to get into it now. But most people only know North Korea as like the post-90s North Korea, when the massive embargoes placed upon North Korea only made things infinitely worse in terms of the widespread famine that they were experiencing. So much starvation, mass deaths. The Korean War wasn't the only blow against the Korean population. It wasn't the only genocidal action that American empire took against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Having said all of that, I am not a based DPRK Jusha supporter, or say that what do you call it, or say things like people are eating burger every day in North Korea or anything like that. Okay, I am not confused about having the family lineage get passed down. Like, I know what that is. That's not democracy. Okay, that is not the Democratic People's Republic. The people are not going, oh my God, this benevolent dictator and his next of kin are so fucking good, that's why we keep voting for them over and over again. That's not how this works. Okay, yeah, it is not It is not a democracy. Anyway, let's continue.
Just as South Korea's economy dramatically improved. In the 1990s, North Korea experienced floods and droughts. This, combined with no longer importing food from the Soviet Union, ultimately led to what became known as the North Korean famine. Some estimate up to 600,000 North Koreans died. North Korea has since somewhat recovered, but yeah, I'm hoping you realize already why these two countries are so...
No, their recovery has been pretty solid over all things considered. If you're rating it on a curve, just like Cuba, you have to look at like what their starting position is and what they have arrived at this point. Having said that, there's still a tremendous amount of political repression as well. For the record, I'm not discounting that at all. Like, I would never do that. And then the same that goes for even like Chinese civil liberties. When we talk about China, many people say, Hasan, you're refusing to recognize many of the countries that find themselves outside of the sphere of American influence engage in certain levels of social and political repression. Part of that is defensive posture that even the likes of America has exhibited time and time again in times of war. America has also done that when it's not directly in hot war, but during the Cold War. Part of that is the reason why so many people have the wrong opinion or are completely oblivious to the nature of Marxism, Marxist-Leninism, socialism, or any kind of anti-capitalist sentiment. It's the Red Scare. It's McCarthyist trials. It's blackballing and sometimes even imprisoning socialists and communists alike. Okay, that is social and political repression utilized by the American state. Social and political repression utilized by the American state during World War II was infinitely worse. As a matter of fact, if you recall, we put up internment camps for every member that was a Japanese American. Okay, it doesn't get more social and political repression than that. Okay, and that was in a dark period of American history, seen as necessary repression during times of war. It was fucking shameful. It was unimaginably racist. I don't think we've ever actually reckoned with that at all. But just so you understand, governments, all governments, this is not like pro or anti-America, it's not pro or anti-China or pro or anti-Cuba. All governments in times of need see political repression as a tool, as a necessary defense. In the instance of a country like Cuba, that has withstood endless cruelty in the hands of American empire for the crime of rising up and revolting against America's aligned dictatorship, okay? A dictatorship that we offered weapons to so they could continue slaughtering Koreans because it was beneficial for us to have Cuba as a tourist destination for the mob and also a place where there are sugar plantations. We never stopped punishing Cuba for liberating itself from the treacherous, fascist, brutal dictatorship of Batista because he was our ally. And in that process, of course, Cuban development and Cuban governance has been fairly restrictive on any sort of sentiment that is against its government. You might not agree with it. I certainly don't agree with it either. But it's important to understand where that social and political repression comes from. Okay? It is impossible for an American to ever comprehend an infinitely larger country with awesome power, with the largest military on the planet, dominating its existence from the moment of revolution. It would be akin to the English Empire, British Empire, basically fucking dominating America, being on the ass cheeks of America and dominating America endlessly for the crime of having the American Revolution. Okay? And never giving that up. So there is a reason for Cuban social and political repression. I would go so far as to say that the Chinese social and political repression is less necessary, even though they still maintain it. Anyway.
Addendum. This video isn't a commentary on whether North Korea is a good or bad country, quote unquote, whatever those labels mean. It's an exploration of why their perspective is the way it is, and any intellectually honest person would be interested in hearing the other side to see if it has merit. Let's continue. North Korea, officially called the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, occupies the northern half of the Korean peninsula. It's bordered by China, the Korean Bay, the Sea of Japan, and of course South Korea. At 120,000 square kilometers in total area, the DPRK houses around 26 million people, with a significant portion residing in urban centers like the capital, Pyongyang.
I'll ping this 22-minute Cold War, what, this one? Oh, the Cold War video? Okay, a lot of people have suggested this Cold War video saying South Korea, brutal dictatorship of the post-war period. But I think it's good to understand first how the partitioning happened and what the impact on North Korea was, and then we'll move on to South Korean political development as well.
The DPRK was officially founded in 1948 under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, establishing a central ideology called Juche, or self-reliance, which has served as a guiding philosophy of sorts for the nation. North Korea's anti-imperial stance is deeply rooted in its early 20th century history, when it was just known as Korea. Long before the US was the imperialist enemy of North Korea, Japan brutally occupied the entire peninsula from 1910 to 1945, a period marked by severe repression, forced assimilation, and sex slavery, an issue of contention with Japan to this day. Policies of forced labor, limited political freedoms for Koreans, and
Japan refused to acknowledge the comfort women. It's a big point of contention in Japanese politics.
mandatory participation in Shinto rituals were calculated to erase the native spiritual practices and
this is what I was going to say that was left out of the original video of like the practice of erasing Korean identity and Korean culture, which plays a pretty formative role.
Culture of Korea. Yet Koreans resisted, reclaiming traditional practices, and ultimately refused to bow down to Japanese imperial demands. After World War II, Korea was arbitrarily divided by the US after realizing that a free and open democratic election would result in an overwhelming Communist Party victory, much like in Germany following World War II. That definitely didn't suit the US, so they instead created a puppet state in what became South Korea, now the Republic of Korea. And while doing this under the guise of defending democracy and freedom, they would install a brutal dictator named Syngman Rhee, an anti-communist exile who barely spent any time in Korea. This is juxtaposed by Kim Il-sung, the man who would go on to lead the DPRK, who had spent his life in the anti-Japanese struggle and for Korean independence.
The problem is with the likes of Kim Il-sung, and this is a thing that you see in many other countries in much more personal ways, but you know, sometimes you have fail sons, and then those fail sons have other fail sons, and you inevitably end up, especially if you have like direct next of kin lineage in terms of like who gets to govern, you end up kind of fucking up the bag a little bit.
The conflict widened in scope when the Soviet Union and China intervened on the side of their ally, with the US doing the same for South Korea. This division set the stage for the Korean War, the first proxy war of the Cold War. Syngman Rhee, a dependable pro-Western puppet, was ruling half the Korean peninsula. Despite his total lack of local support, the first thing he did was suppress the incredibly popular left, much like Suharto would go on to do in Indonesia, always with American support, of course. Check out the Jakarta method.
The Jakarta method is...
Rhee did so enthusiastically and systematically. Under Rhee and the US's occupation of South Korea, only those deemed
Listen, we just gave them the coordinates and who we suspected of being communists. We didn't tell them that they should use the guns that sometimes they got from us on their unsuspecting civilian population. How could we have known that they would slaughter millions of people? How could we have known that? We simply gave them lists of names of suspected communists. Who could have thought that they would end up slaughtering every single person, of suspected communist allegiances? And this doesn't mean that they were slaughtering card-carrying communists that were trying to engage in militancy, okay? They were slaughtering motherfuckers who were like, yeah, I think women and men should be equal. They were slaughtering people. Many of them were involved in student protests and student organizing. They were slaughtering people who wanted to engage in any sort of like pro-democracy initiative, for example. So a lot of this stuff doesn't stop with, and I obviously personally would consider it ridiculous and inhumane to just go and be like, oh yeah, you're suspected as a communist or you're a card-carrying communist, so you deserve execution. Okay, I don't think that is appropriate either. But it didn't even go, it went far beyond that. They would just kill intellectuals. They would kill people for the crime of saying like, yeah, I don't know if we should do this. It never stops with just the communists. So even if you are some doughy-eyed social democrat who's like, well, I don't know, maybe some of these communists deserve it. Just remember that like they killed the social democrats as well. This is how it usually works. They do not want any sort of fucking opposition whatsoever. Yeah, teachers and unions with no official political ideology were sexually harassed by guards and brutalized. Some were minors.
Reliable or loyal, by American standards, had any place in Korean politics. By 1946, the US military dictatorship in South Korea had filled all of its government positions with right-wing elites to the exclusion of popular worker and peasant movements. And by exclusion, I mean by imprisoning their leaders, pushing them underground, or just outright killing them. This violent suppression led to the isolation of all opposition, and left a single party to rule the South. But any democracy was just for show, since liberals love political theater, and the US wanted to play dress-up with political legitimacy. Despite this, many South Koreans continued to support socialist ideals and continued to be imprisoned for it. Meanwhile, in the North, reforms that were begun prior to American intervention were happening fast. Within months, North Korea abolished landlords, redistributed land, and nationalized industries, exactly the kind of necessary overhaul that had long been called for by Koreans for a liberated Korea. It is and was a formula that actually works to end poverty for the widest base of society. Unlike the violent repression in the South, the North's transformation was quick and efficient, creating a government aligned with local aspirations rooted in Korean culture. And like clockwork, anytime the US sees a project not aligned with its interests take root and begin to bear fruit, it tries to cut it down and turn it into wood chips. Here enters the Korean War, where over the next few years, American forces dropped an estimated 635,000 tons of bombs across Korea, with the majority of that hitting the North, including 32,000 tons of napalm. More bombs hit Korea than Japan in World War II, which is quite a feat. The core history of the conflict is complicated, and who begun the war with what actions depends on which action you consider critical for sparking the conflict. Watch the following video for further detail, or check out the fantastic work Patriots, Traitors, and Empires, The Story of Korea's Struggle for Freedom by Goans for a deeper dive. Anyway, the goal was obvious, to destroy North Korea's industrial capacity and to break the will of its people. Cities like Pyongyang were leveled to the point that civilians had to take refuge in caves to survive the onslaught. In fact, the total amount of destruction rendered practically every city of the North completely flattened. I made a video that covered this in further detail here. In 1952, North Korea was left in ruins. Bombings destroyed crucial infrastructure, creating massive shortages in food, housing, and basic supplies. Entire communities survived in caves, shanties, or improvised shelters. The destruction of hydroelectric dams led to widespread flooding, crippling agriculture even further. Fertilizer factories were among the many targeted, contributing to an agricultural crisis that left North Korea on the brink of famine. The toll from this collection of circumstances was utterly devastating. Approximately 2 million North Koreans had died, most of them civilians who fell victim to US bombs and starvation, in just a few short years. These strategic bombings weren't just meant to win a war, they were intended to systematically dismantle North Korea's ability to survive independently. As a result of this extensive bombing and napalming, only a small percentage of North Korea's agricultural land remains arable today. The 1953 armistice only ended active military combat, but it left the peninsula in limbo. South Korea refused to sign the armistice, but had other agreements with the US that
They wanted to nuke Korea as well, for the record, in the process.
halted their active military operations.
This was also considered formative for the Dahia Doctrine as well. I think Hakim in his video, it might have been Hakim or someone else that we watched that talked about how like prior American military doctrine led the Israeli military in applying the Dahia Doctrine into the way that they wage war, where it's like, it doesn't matter if it's a small group of people, it doesn't matter if there's any sort of like militant uprising. The goal there is to punish the entire population by universalizing the pain. This is the way that America wages war. This is the way that Israel wages war as well, where the goal is to basically destroy all matter of civilian life in an effort to ensure that there is never any sort of like uprising ever again.
The US later signed a mutual defense treaty with its loyal puppet South Korea, committing to a permanent military presence along the fortified 38th parallel, which remains one of the most militarized borders in the world today. The ongoing US presence has only deepened the divide. For North Koreans, the memory of the US invasion and the destruction it caused is an integral part of their identity. The systematic devastation of neighborhoods, infrastructure, and food supplies has been ingrained in North Korean consciousness as a proof of American aggression. That's not forgetting the 10 to 20% of the population that was killed as a result. Understanding this context is crucial. It's why North Korea sees the US as a central obstacle to peace, independence, and unification on the Korean peninsula. And they happen to be correct about that point. The Korean War is only the beginning of the story. The United States went further and has waged a decades-long economic war that's made it increasingly difficult for the people living in North Korea to survive. One of the primary tools America uses to get their way is sanctions. These economic blockades are designed to cripple a nation, isolate it from the world, and bring about conditions of change favorable to American foreign policy, all while framing the oppression as a morally justified response to rogue behavior.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And, you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
And all of this happens without any reflection that, at a certain point, sanctions just become collective punishment which should be against international law and is technically a war crime. This is especially true when it comes to US sanctions on North Korea. The US, in its arrogance, has behaved as if controlling North Korea's economy through sanctions was some kind of divine right. During Clinton's regime, the US unleashed severe economic sanctions on 35 countries, which at the time affected 42% of the world's population, having lethal consequences on a mass scale due to basic living standards plummeting under the guise of protecting global security, a favorite liberal trope. This tactic isn't new or unique. It's an ancient strategy that involves starving a subject population into submission and manipulating public sentiment against their government. In other words, it's extortion on a mass scale, or terrorism, or whatever other term that's valid. Yet North Korea's people have proven to be tremendously resilient, which renders sanctions ineffective and makes sanctions even crueler than they already are. Instead of fermenting dissent, sanctions have only fueled a fierce collective defiance reinforced against the US and its allies. Take it from me, an Iraqi. No one in Iraq has ever felt that the Iraqi government is responsible for the suffering imposed on it by the American sanctions regime.
This is a very normal tendency for people to harden their position against those who actually cripple them and destroy them.
The severe...
I always say sanctions can only work on your allies, and the mere threat of sanctions is enough for your ally to stop their bad behavior. Sanctions end up never really working on your enemies, at least if the goal is like overthrowing a regime.
And deep and enduring anti-Americanism in Iraq is a direct result of American policies in the region and particularly in my country. It's no different in Syria, in Libya, in Afghanistan, or in the DPRK. One of the most destructive aspects of US sanctions for North Korea is the carefully calculated restriction of essential medical and humanitarian supplies. For example, under the 2017 sanctions, any metal products were broadly prohibited, which meant that medical shipments that included essential sterilization tools, like aluminum steam sterilizers used in reproductive health kits and surgical instruments, were effectively not allowed entry into the DPRK. By blocking something as basic as this, any and all public health efforts are made harder or even impossible, since hospitals have a harder time keeping conditions hygienic enough to perform safe procedures. Worse still, North Korean hospitals cannot obtain spare parts for essential devices like CT scanners, ventilators, and X-ray machines without applying for some special export license, and even these are often denied or face long delays. And of course, the US has sanctions on fuel, like refined petroleum and diesel fuel. Those fuels power hospital generators, heating facilities, and running medical equipment. Again, rural hospitals have been hit harder and are forced to reduce operations during the winter months, which leaves pregnant women, young children, and elderly patients at risk. Without vital medical equipment, such as respirators running, many completely avoidable deaths occur, which they wouldn't were it not for US sanctions. Despite
Someone said, why couldn't they get this from the USSR? Dog, what do they have, time machines? It fell at this point. America won. They used to. It's kind of a big part of this conversation, is that they used to. It's just that it no longer exists at this point. And they got fucking massive famines and drought. Flooding and then drought.
Despite these sanctions, however, the DPRK has against all odds formed a model healthcare system for low-income countries, in comparison to that of the wealthiest country on Earth, which guarantees basically nothing in terms of healthcare for its citizens, despite profiting handsomely from spreading misery around the globe. Moving on. For all the criticism leveled at the DPRK for censorship and not letting people contact the outside world, much of it is warranted, they conveniently leave out the fact that even telecommunications infrastructure is sanctioned by the US. Until recently, even something as simple as making a phone call across the border was hampered by sanctions because a direct connection wasn't allowed. In this case, a South Korean company operating in the Kaesong industrial complex had to reroute calls through China at an exorbitant rate of $3.60 per minute due to US restrictions. I don't think most Americans would pay $3.60 per minute for a phone call, let alone citizens of impoverished third world countries. You don't need to take my word for it. The United Nations says economic sanctions exacerbate poverty, disproportionately impact vulnerable populations, and generate unethical business practices that exploit scarcity. Unfortunately, North Korea is no exception. NGOs and humanitarian agencies that help in providing basic necessities to North Koreans state that they are restricted from operating efficiently, often due to long searches and other delays because of US sanctions. These sanctions go against the 1949 Geneva Conventions, which condemns punishments of civilians for the actions of its government. And yet that's exactly what the sanctions do, as we've seen. Food and medical supplies are held up, delayed, or outright blocked. In one absurd case, it took an NGO over a year to deliver just 16 boxes of beans to North Korea. This blatant disregard for humanitarian concerns proves the US is more interested in the systematic punishment of an entire people for the so-called crime of having the wrong government or for being born in the wrong country. Take your pick. A UNICEF report in 2018 estimated that 200,000 North Korean children suffered from acute malnutrition, with 60,000 at risk of starvation because of the delays in humanitarian aid. To remind you, agricultural tools and inputs are also sanctioned by the US, adding on top of the bulk of the arable land being ruined by American bombing runs in the 1950s. This is the definition of shooting someone in the leg and then blaming them when they can't walk. The fact that this suffering is largely ignored by
There's also a limited amount of arable land in every country to begin with, okay? Like, that's the reason why you do trade. And if you're completely blocked out of all semblance of trade from the rest of the planet because of the largest imperial force on the fucking planet, then yeah, you're cooked. What are you supposed to do? Eat the fucking rock? It's very fucked up.
The international community, never called out for being the crime that it is, only strengthens the DPRK's case and perspective against the US, as they witness firsthand the human cost of these cruel and pointless sanctions. If anyone truly cared about human rights in the DPRK, they'd immediately call for the lifting of economic sanctions. Sanctions on North Korea don't just target the government, I think that's clear. They seep into every layer of society and erode the living standards of ordinary citizens. In fact, that is the stated goal of many of the sanctions. For example, the textile industry is one of North Korea's main sources of employment, and has been hit very hard by sanctions. Exports are blocked, which means thousands of textile workers, many of whom are women, find themselves unemployed or with reduced income. As a result, many are forced into black market activities to afford everyday necessities like food and clothing. Fishing is another critical industry and food resource nearly severed by sanctions, wiping out a sector that once provided a stable income for many coastal communities for centuries. No access to export markets means a cap on just how much they can catch and viably benefit from. This destabilizes local economies along the coast, along with all downstream industries such as fish processors, transporters, and vendors who rely on fishing industry for their livelihood. Other fuels and metals, like coal and iron ore, North Korea's primary exports, have also felt the wrath of sanctions. In 2018, China's imports of North Korean coal dropped by 88% due to international sanctions, which stripped North Korea of a major and badly needed source of income. By now, you should know the pattern. The US sanctions a commodity, the decline in business forces closures of production facilities, and all downstream production is similarly affected. It's the same story with coal mines and associated facilities, which resulted in more unemployment and further impoverished communities. These are not luxury industries or military projects. They are, or were, the backbone of North Korea's civilian economy. Without access to global markets, North Koreans are forced to use black markets, where prices for things even as basic as food can be prohibitively expensive. And to wrap up, let's stay on the employment issue. The labor market is severely restricted as a result of what was said previously, but also because of sanctions that take away access to joint employment opportunities. In essence, you can't invest in North Korea. An example of this trend is the shutdown of the Kaesong Industrial Complex. It was a large joint North-South facility that employed over 50,000 North Koreans and a symbol of friendship between the South and the North. The shutdown, because of sanctions, resulted in these 50,000 North Koreans being under or unemployed. These are nefarious policies aimed at maximizing misery for the interests of American capital. The United States has likewise kept a military stranglehold on the Korean Peninsula for decades, with roughly 28,000 troops stationed at a few large bases across South Korea meant to counter any potential aggression from the north. This isn't a temporary deployment, and it's extremely expensive, for South Korea, of course. The US isn't altruistic even to its allies. In a recent deal, South Korea agreed to pay over $1.1 billion, with further increases capped at 5% per year, to host the US military presence, a price pushed by the Biden administration to solidify a deal before any possible disruption from the second Trump administration. This new agreement lasts until 2030 to make absolutely sure that it survives past Trump into whatever administration follows him. For North Korea, these forces are there as a threat, obviously. It's the most technically sophisticated military on Earth and its local ally, stationed across the border against your sanctioned and small country. It can be nothing else. Anyway, each year, the US and South Korea carry out joint military so-called exercises, training in everything from missile defense to simulated invasion drills. One of the most extensive, Ulchi Freedom Shield, involved a combination of computer-simulated and live-fire exercises, with some 19,000 South Korean soldiers participating in drills against North Korean attack scenarios, essentially joint US-South Korean invasion exercises. This isn't really a war game, it's a display of power backed up by the increased presence of US long-range nuclear-armed bombers, submarines, and strike groups in the region. Who is the aggressor here, again? North Korea has responded predictably, positioning their nuclear program as an essential deterrent against American aggression. If Iraq had done the same, then we would still be an independent country, and without the excess of 1 million deaths caused by the illegal American invasion. Despite official US claims that regime change
HASANABI doctrine, get the nukes.
isn't the objective, statements and strategies of several US regimes suggest otherwise. North Korea watched other states like Libya dismantle their defenses only to face regime change at the hands of the US. If the DPRK were to disarm, it would likely face a similar fate, being exposed to an aggressive enemy that has historically favored extreme and unrelenting force over diplomacy. So, we should really view North Korea's nuclear deterrent more as a survival strategy against an American military presence than the unhinged world-ending musings of a psychopath. Likewise, and more importantly, they offered to stop nuclear testing entirely for a pledge
Low-key, if Ukraine never gave up its nukes, I think it'd be a dramatically different situation right now.
that the US wouldn't attack. The US ignored the memo, of course. This is one of the many extended olive branches from the north that have gone ignored. Western media's portrayal of the DPRK as a rogue state is a framing used by imperialist powers to vilify nations that defy their hegemony, and also serve as a source of circular logic that itself assumes the US wouldn't lie about something like that for political gain, despite that literally being the point. In this narrative, North Korea is depicted as a dangerous, irrational actor, a threat to global and regional stability, and an obstacle to progress. Progress as defined and measured by what is most profitable to Western capital interests, interestingly enough. Let's not forget the trillions of dollars worth of rare earth metals under North Korean soil. We even made a video on that you can check out here. Few analysts or policymakers attempt to actually understand how the DPRK perceives American aggression, preferring to push a simplistic, cartoonish, and unserious one-sided image of the nation as a villain beyond redemption. This framing is used to block or at least slow down any genuine resolution, which makes sure the crisis continues to serve US imperial interests. However, if we strip away the nonsense, North Korea is being punished because it refuses to submit to globalized exploitation by Western powers, which makes it the ultimate enemy. The DPRK is described as reclusive, backward, and isolated, but no mention is made of the sanctions which hold that end as their explicit purpose. Yet the nation persists, defying expectations of collapse, relying on defense and small concessions extracted from an international community too cowardly to defy the US. Even when the US outwardly recognizes the need for negotiation, as in the Perry report, its approach and actions still treat North Korea as inherently irrational and dangerous. This ideological project is not limited to the DPRK. Cuba, another country falsely labeled as a rogue state, and I've covered in this series here, has been resisting similar imperialist domination. Cuba is also painted as an unrepentant regime led by an irrational and dangerous group.
I would say Cuba and Korea have been presented in the same vein, but I think Cuba's a little bit better. I don't know. Like, Cuba has historically been able to withstand and develop in far better ways. Partially because they didn't have fucking, I guess, the mass famine. Yeah, better climate plays a role. Better agricultural outputs play a big role. They didn't get bombed into oblivion. But I'm saying, but this is post-90s, chat. Because North Korea was able to recover. North Korea was able to recover after the Korean War with the help of the USSR. That's why I'm saying, like, it's a little bit different from 90s onward.
Whose system must change to serve Western capital, of course. This rhetoric suggests these nations are so desperate to maintain power that they endanger their own populations and global stability, framing their survival as both an anomaly and a threat, as simultaneously weak and strong, like how fascists like to depict all their enemies. Instead of engaging with their histories, imperialist discourse reduces North Korea and Cuba to caricatures, presenting their leaders as the sole architects of their nation's problems and suffering. Be completely honest with yourself. Have you ever heard any talk about sanctions, or how they impact the average North Korean before this video? Particularly in the Western press? I would bet on no. However, propaganda against the DPRK extends to more than just this. The US and its allies have also and continue to conduct direct campaigns. From propaganda leaflet bombs in the Korean War to balloons filled with anti-regime messages and US dollars sent from South Korea, attempts at undermining the country are ceaseless. That's aside from all the silliest claims that you see shared all over, with no sources as always. For an overview of that, check out my earlier video here. For further details on defectors and why their stories so frequently fall apart, check out another video here.
I think one of the funniest parts about this is that, like, there is an entire marketplace for defection, obviously, because people are fascinated by the hermit nation. But having said that, even all of the other people that have made a name for themselves in the defector orbit, some of which who literally are like, yo, this shit sucks, and then they sometimes want to go back because they don't have job opportunities in South Korea due to the same exact job market that, like, South Koreans have to withstand, but also because they additionally get profiled because they're North Korean and then sometimes leave and go back to North Korea. All of that fucking industry in unison, virtually every single person in the defector industry turned around and said Yeonmi Park is out of her fucking mind. Like, virtually every single person was like, yo, Yeonmi Park, that lady is crazy. What the fuck are you guys talking about? What a time. What a fucking amazing time that was. One of my most vindicated long-standing criticisms. Okay, well, I don't care about the rest of this, but now let's talk about the South Korean development as a parallel in the same time frame.
Popular perception is often portrayed as the good of Western democracy versus the evil of totalitarianism. And I get why. It's an easy binary for people to understand, even if they don't agree with the labels. But like anything in history, it's never that simple. What if we told you that evil wasn't always evil and good wasn't always good? Today, we are going to look at an example of when the good was far more problematic than many people realize. I'm your host, David, and today we are going to look at the situation in South Korea in the period after the Korean War. This is the Cold War.
How could you not believe that Yeonmi Park was brought into slavery by a mentally disabled man? No, you don't remember that story correctly. It wasn't just the mentally disabled man. It was the entire family. Everyone in the Chinese family was mentally disabled, according to Yeonmi Park's story. Like, literally, the whole family. Yeah. Not a single one that was not mentally disabled in the Chinese family that bought Yeonmi Park from North Korea. It might have even been a whole village, if I'm not remembering. I might be misremembering. Sometimes I am the foremost authority on Yeonmi Park lore. You know, who could forget some of the choice words that she had for Columbia University that she said was exactly like North Korea. Wokeness demonstrated by Columbia University students and teachers alike was akin to the totalitarian leadership of Kim Jong-un. Yeah.
I'm a busy guy with lots of great projects going on, so sometimes I need a little help to let me find some mental clarity so I can stay productive. I am so glad to be using the sponsor of this video, Endel, a uniquely useful application that creates personalized creative to
August 16, 1940.
First 100 people to download Endel using the link in the description.
Too late, you're not going to be one of the first. This is a 2-year-old video.
Get a free week of audio experiences. This will also support our channel.
On August 16, 1945, a day after Emperor Hirohito proclaimed the unconditional surrender of Japan, thousands of Koreans spilled into the streets, joining together in joyous celebrations. People danced, partied, and marched up and down the boulevards, waving Korean flags. After 4 decades of Japanese occupation, the peninsula would finally be independent. Unbeknownst to them, however, the newly emerged superpowers had already divided their land into 2 occupation zones with the border marked along the 38th parallel. And how did that come about? Well, only a few days prior to the Japanese surrender, the Soviet Union had entered the Pacific War and had begun offensive operations into Manchuria and the northern parts of Korea. Facing the prospect of a complete Soviet occupation of the entire peninsula, the United States urgently came up with a plan to split Korea in 2, using the 38th parallel as the line simply because it would put Seoul into the American sphere.
Okay, respect to this analysis so far.
Our good friend and supporter of this channel, General Douglas MacArthur, proclaimed this decision on August 15th in the General Order No. 1. To be honest, the Soviets could have easily rejected this and pushed for total control of all of Korea, as American and Allied troops were not in any position to challenge the Soviets. But to everyone's surprise, they raised no objections. Well, they did demand possession of Japan's northern island of Hokkaido, but MacArthur of course refused. The Koreans, for their part, were quick to establish people's committees throughout the provinces, as well as the People's Republic of Korea, which served as the central governing institution connecting them. Don't be fooled by the name though. Despite being called peoples, and the association we have with them now as representing socialist or communist governments, these committees encompass the entire political spectrum, since the task at hand was the decolonization of the peninsula. The PRK leaders chose as president a right-wing nationalist, Syngman Rhee, who, with the blessings of the American government, arrived in Seoul in mid-October. In one of those weird moments of history, Rhee wasn't initially asked if he wanted to be elected, so when he became aware of it, he actually refused the position. Just a few days before, the USSR had revealed their own champion in Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung, presented before a cheering crowd. With spheres of influence now determined and the major political players in place, the two superpowers began reshaping the political landscape of their respective sides of the line dividing the peninsula. The Soviets faced opposition from the right-leaning nationalist and Christian tendencies of the population, and while they did recognize the PRK and the committees, they did everything they could to make sure Kim Il-sung would gain the upper hand. For the Americans, however, the situation was a bit more complex. Seoul was the heart of the Korean political world, and disagreements between the Korean right wing and the United States Army military government in Korea, or USAMGIP, were not out of the ordinary. Discontent among the populace was also growing, fueled by rampant inflation, unemployment, poverty, and opposition to occupation policies. Many of the disenchanted turned to leftist-led labor movements, resulting in a general strike and the Daegu Uprising in the fall of 1946, which quickly spread across the southern provinces. The government crackdown that followed.
What will happen? Popular leftist uprising in American-controlled Korea? Surely the Americans go, wow, the people of Korea, the working class of Korea, seemingly are resentful against our guy. As a nation that is tasked with defending the principle of liberal democracy, we will certainly ensure that the people's wishes will be, the people's actions will be rewarded with swift justice in the direction of the demands being made by this popular uprising. Certainly, right? I wonder what will happen in South Korea next.
Followed resulted in the deaths of 92 policemen, 163 civil workers, 116 civilians, 240 rioters, and the arrest of around 2,600 people.
Wait, what? No!
In the South,
No! What? That's not what?
Americans were mostly concerned with rooting out communist influence, naturally, yet the Korean far right didn't limit itself in dealing with just the leftists. They were determined to exterminate any political opposition that appeared to be a threat, including the prominent politicians Yeo Un-hyung and Kim Gu, who were assassinated in July of 1947.
What the fuck? Yo, chill. What? I mean, certainly American intervention is about to kick in any moment now, right? Because they fucking hate. They hate this sort of thing. They hate it when a foreign country is behaving this way. I mean, this is this is at this point our protectorate, you know? This is a country that we have profound interest in against the bulwark of communism. Let's see.
And June 1949, respectively. The American occupation forces did their part in uprooting communist elements, declaring the People's Committees illegal, stopping...
What? Whoa, what? No. What do you mean? No, but what about, but liberal democracy? What do you mean? What? You mean to tell me that the American military occupation helped? Stop. He's, you joke. You must joke.
Out every activity that was
Hasan, I'm as shocked as you are. It's okay. I am shocked. I'm confused. I fear that, I thought that this would be the opposite. America always does colonial occupation with good intentions in mind. Guys, surely, bear with me here. Surely this is a one-off. And I'm sure that as soon as they realize that they're just murking fucking random student protesters, the American government will change its course and not severely escalate the penalties that the Korean people now have to withstand. No, I think this is just a one-off. It was an accident. They didn't understand that this wasn't like about rooting out communism, which, by the way, in and of itself is not an honorable goal. Let's see.
Deemed red and arresting or killing hundreds of communist activists. Now, while each side was purging their political adversaries, several gatherings between US and Soviet authorities took place with the intent of uniting Korea, though it quickly became evident these discussions were fruitless as neither side was willing to back down.
Yeah, I wonder why. One side would be like, dude, you're fucking literally murking people living in the area that you're controlling and for exhibiting sentiment. I mean, it just seems like a lot of people have died, but like certainly it's not going to. Certainly this is not going to lead to more deaths. I know my America. My America, not my America, I say, you know? They're just trying to reason with these guys. They're just trying to reason with the big bad. I'm sure that there won't be more deaths and destruction that is coming down the pipe.
Eventually, the Americans decided to shift responsibility to a newly created provisional council in the South, headed by Syngman Rhee, and the United Nations that would sponsor elections in 1948. While the prospect of free elections sounded good, the communists living in the South didn't take the news well, as a separate southern state, especially run by a rightist government, was against their goals. So it didn't take long until a large uprising occurred, this time on Jeju Island. The fighting between guerrillas and government forces would last for a year, but the insurgency didn't have the power to stop the elections from taking place in the rest of the country. Well, rest meaning only the southern part, as the Soviets denied access to UN officials. Nevertheless, the people showed great enthusiasm in voting for their leaders for the first time, though within a month, the elected assembly voted to implement a presidential system instead of a parliamentary one, a move that showcased Rhee's political power. This also set a precedent for indirect presidential election, a move that would be used in the future to maintain dictatorial regimes. Rhee was then...
Is that FaZe Lacey, dude? Yo, do you want to play an OG Fortnite tournament on Monday? Everyone's playing? Nah, I can't do that. Mondays are my news days, unfortunately. And also, I'm anti-Fortnite in general. But thank you for the invite. Ya niye bağırıyorsunuz? Ama ayıp yani. They're like literally, my mom and dad are just like yelling at one another jokingly right next to my ear. Thank you, Lacey, for the invite. Yeah, I want to go back to this really quickly. Something to remember. Were there partisans, or not partisans, were there like right-wing people in North Korea? Of course there were. Okay, were they violently dealt with? Certainly. You have to think about what the political ambitions are for the people that are being suppressed violently oftentimes, why they're being suppressed violently oftentimes. In many circumstances in like USSR aligned countries, and they're not infallible either, there's certainly a lot of violence that gets dished around, different time and place overall. The targets of ire, or the targets of violent action, or any sort of serious political or criminal repercussions in USSR aligned countries was almost always those in positions of power, those who own capital, those who want to maintain allegiances to, so oftentimes right-wing fascists, specifically because they wanted to disrupt and maintain a capitalist mode of production. Now, in that process, I need you to understand, in that process, were there a lot of unjustifiable penalties that regular ass people incurred? Abso-fucking-lutely. Okay. The difference, however, is that like the uprisings that they're talking about are not even entirely communist. The uprisings they're talking about that the South Korean government squashed violently were literally just a collection of no right-wing uprisings in North Korea at the time, no massive popular discontent at the time at least. Yeah. And also on top of that, the uprisings are happening completely outside of the scope of like North Korea. It's not like they're, egging it on or something. These are just like people who think, well, my fucking family members live in the North, and I also have sympathies to not living under American occupation. These were students. These were fucking students who were slaughtered ruthlessly.
Tuesday marks the 70th anniversary of the Jeju Massacre of 1948.
This is a South Korean broadcaster that is, many years later talking about the Jeju Massacre. I need you to understand, like, this is the most conservative way to approach the subject matter.
Significant tragedy in modern Korean history. The incident refers to the killing of some 30,000 Jeju Island residents at the hands of the police and military. And since a government fact-finding report came out in 2003, activists have called for a deeper investigation to shed more light on what happened, but the search for truth has been slow in coming.
Cheongbang Waterfall is a famed tourist destination on Jeju-do Island, known for its scenic landscape. But 70 years ago, the sea below the waterfall was the site of a tragic bloodshed. At the time of the incident on April 3, 1948, the area was crowded with police stations and detention camps where mass slaughters were perpetrated. 247 people are so far known to have died in this area. However, based on testimonies that killings were conducted every day, the number of victims appears to be much higher.
By the way, yeah, as the chatter also correctly pointed out, if you're shocked by 30,000, Google Indonesia. Jakarta method. Because, god damn, that fucking slaughter puts this to shame. Mass slaughter, also led by American-backed freaks, led to an insane amount of people being butchered. So the thing is, Sri Lanka as well. The thing is, if you don't have a real popular method of governance, as long as you're aligned with U.S. interests and openly say, like, I'm anti-communist to the fucking bone, they will literally let you do mini holocausts in your own country, and they will arm you for it. They will arm you so you can do it. Sometimes they'll use American soldiers to support and facilitate and engage in active militant defense. Sometimes they will give you intelligence information that they share with your intelligence community, specifically so that you have a never-ending sea of targets that you can slaughter. This is how it goes in the name of liberalization and liberation.
시체도 찾지 못한 분들도 많이 있는데 앞으로 우리
It says many haven't even found the remains of their loved ones, so I hope this can be addressed as well as other areas that must come to light.
그거에 좀 더 노력하고 또 그 확실하게 우리가 규명을 낼 수 있는 그런 것들이 더 노력해주기를 바랍니다.
Identifying the whereabouts of those who are unaccounted for is also a pressing task. Some 5,000 people on the island are believed to have gone missing at the time, but how and why remains unknown. Government support is urgently necessary for a state-level investigation into the Jeju massacre, whose many facts remain in the dark even after 70 years.
Yeah, I mean, this is like the brutal South Korean dictatorship fucking absolutely slaughtering people who led a popular uprising against the brutal South Korean government. At the time, America fucking 100% was like, oh, they're killing communists. It's great. And it's wild because, once again, they weren't even fucking communists. It's completely unacceptable even if they were. But the very fact that they weren't communists also makes this even crazier.
UN officials. Nevertheless, the people showed great enthusiasm in voting for their leaders for the first time, though within a month, the elected assembly voted to implement a presidential system instead of a parliamentary one, a move that showcased Ri's political power. This also set a precedent for indirect presidential election, a move that would be used in the future to maintain dictatorial regimes. Ri was then, unsurprisingly, elected president by the assembly on the 20th of June, and the new Republic of Korea was inaugurated on August 15th, on the third anniversary of liberation.
I'll give you an example. If the Syrian Ba'athist Party was aligned with the United States of America, the horrific nature of the Assad regime would never be discussed. It would be not even a blip on American history. He would, one, still be ruling Syria. It wouldn't matter. Two, he could be as cruel as he fucking wanted to. You would never hear about the fucking prisons. Okay? Never in a million years. And this isn't to say that, like, Bashar al-Assad was an anti-imperialist to the bone or something like that. He wasn't. He was just a horrifically incompetent and very selfish regional power that was definitely playing enough ball with the other regional powers, but that also meant that he was, in an effort to maintain his regime, utilizing Hezbollah and also, which was, the Iranian-backed military groups, and also Russia, in order to continue his dominance over the people. So for me, the way I see it, if he was using America instead, maybe even Turkey alongside America, using NATO forces to suppress all these people, he would be cherished as a fucking hero. He would be given the opportunity to do such things and would be celebrated for it. I was thinking about this the other day. It's like he's a secular guy, right? This is the secular Ba'athist Party. Virtually every single aspect of any kind of popular uprising from the Sunni Syrian population would be stamped out as jihadists. Now, this doesn't mean that there aren't jihadists, okay? This doesn't mean that there aren't Salafists in the fucking popular resistance against Assad. They certainly have been overtaken by these groups, okay? Excuse me, HTS is former jihadi, former Al-Qaeda. Having said that, however, there was obviously a very good reason for why people felt resentful, angry, fearful of the Assad regime. But always remember, if Assad was unconditionally pro-America across the board, you would have never heard about anything. You wouldn't have heard about chemical weapons. You wouldn't have heard about the prisons. You wouldn't have heard about the fucking torture, and this is proof. Okay, the way that South Korean development is discussed in the Western world. Okay, the way that the South Korean government is discussed in the Western world is never with clear terms such as this. Okay.
The Soviet Union would reply a few weeks later by formally establishing the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Both states claimed sovereignty over the entire Korean peninsula, a policy that set the stage for a head-on collision. So life wasn't easy for the newborn southern state. For starters, the rebellion on Jeju Island was still going on, and another uprising would be added to that in mid-autumn. Known as the Yeosu-Suncheon Rebellion, it began on October 19th in the port city of Yeosu after disgruntled soldiers of the 6th and 14th Regiments refused to fight against the Jeju guerrillas. Within a day, the 2,000 rebels had total control of the city.
It's so weird. Why is this objectively popular American-backed government breeding so much hostility by the population it's supposed to be democratically governing?
And soon seized Suncheon as well as other nearby towns. They were joined by leftists waving red flags and calling for a Korean People's Republic, the old PRK, though some raised North Korean flags and pledged their loyalty to Kim Il-sung. They even went so far as to establish people's courts and then tried and executed several police officers, government officials, landlords, and rightists. A newspaper controlled by the rebels made their goals known to the public. First, all Americans would have to leave Korea and all government authority should be transferred to the People's Committee of Yeosu. It also called for land redistribution, a purge of officials who had cooperated in the past with the Japanese, and finally a union of the land under the Northern regime. They would get none of these things, however, certainly not on America's watch. With US personnel in advisory and organizing roles, the South Korean army managed to largely suppress the rebellion, though pockets of resistance would remain until 1957. But the violence didn't stop there, as reprisals from loyalists began, who went on to shoot people who they had the slightest suspicion of supporting communist uprising. In total, around 3,000 people were killed in the uprising that ultimately had only one winner, Syngman Rhee, who used the opportunity to further strengthen his power and wipe out all resistance to his rule. In May of the following year, the larger rebellion on Jeju Island was put down as well. It was an unprecedented massacre as both
Still you sit here and listen to this from a Western world country? What?
sides, especially the South Korean government, committed atrocities to his rule. In May of the following year, the larger rebellion on Jeju Island was put down as well. It was an unprecedented massacre as both sides, especially the South Korean government, committed atrocities and war crimes, resulting in entire villages being wiped from the map. Estimates indicated around 30,000 casualties, although privately, the governor of the island reported almost 60,000 dead. Almost as shocking was the fact that for
Guys, I don't understand. These are the American-backed government. Like, what is happening here? I don't get it. What the fuck is going on, man? I don't understand. Like, I don't understand. America's the good guys. Why are they doing a complete fucking... Why are they ethnically cleansing entire villages for their political mobilization? Why is America not stepping in and seemingly working in lockstep every step of the way? I don't understand. Why is America not using its own pre-existing laws against a foreign ally that's currently also committing a genocide in Gaza? Why is America not stopping Israel? They are the good guys. Why are they not doing that? Perhaps it's not America stopping these countries, but instead not only allowing them to do this, but also urging them to do so.
50 years afterwards, even the mention of these events was a crime punishable by beatings, torture, and time in prison. But while Syngman Rhee was putting out one fire, another one was being lit, this time on the opposite side of the country, when on the 4th of May, border battles began at Kaesong, an incident initiated by the South. Skirmishes and raids along the 38th parallel would continue until December, and the only reason all-out war didn't break out that year was that both superpowers wanted to avoid war and made clear they wouldn't help if an unprovoked general attack was launched. So, going into 1950, the strategy for both sides was to hope for a provocation from the other side.
Yeah, for the record, I need you to understand something. The Korean War has yet to start. Like, in the way that it's taught in history books, understand that this hasn't started yet. Just like Deir Yassin is not featured in the Israeli War of Independence, okay, as a pivotal point, or the Nakba is a important aspect of like Israeli nation state development in its inception. This kind of stuff is not even considered to be to play a motivational role in the actions of the DPRK. just so you understand. Like, all jokes aside, the big bad, America's like direct and active involvement has yet to begin. My professor at uni was raving about the killings in Indonesia were bad, but led to good things in the future. And Sukarno was a smart politician. I lost my mind when she said that. Yeah. Ask her if she feels that way about fucking Adolf Hitler. Insane.
So as to ensure assistance from their guarantor. But the strategic situation had changed by the spring of 1950, as the Soviets had broken the US monopoly on nuclear weapons, and Mao Zedong had achieved final victory for the communists in China. So in April, Stalin gave his permission to Kim Il-sung for an attack on the South, so long as Mao was willing to assist him. While concerned about US involvement, Mao ultimately agreed to support the North Korean endeavor, and preparations for the war that would break out at the end of the summer were escalated. Now, we've covered the events of the war in detail in other episodes, so we're going to fast forward a bit to 1953 and South Korea in the aftermath of the war. If you haven't watched our episodes on the Korean War, we'll link them in the show notes. Although devastating, the Korean War actually gave South Korea the chance to start again with a clean slate. Let me explain. The old aristocracy that once controlled people, markets, and enterprises had lost its political powers through land redistribution.
It's good that we watched the other video because it I think, covered the war already. And I think this hyper focuses on South Korean politics in the lead up to the Korean War and in the aftermath of the Korean War. So it's good to, we already saw the fucking worst aspects of the Korean War. We already covered it earlier or with the Hakim video.
And because the war had caused mass migrations, which in turn shook things up in a country where solidity of lineage and place were pivotal. They were substituted by entrepreneurs that had amassed fortunes through war-related enterprises, middle-class merchants, and by some people that had engaged in more nefarious economic activities. You know, like money lending and black marketeering. Many of present-day South Korea's great corporations began taking shape during this period. But that didn't mean that the majority of people enjoyed any economic prosperity. Rhee's numismatic policy of just print more money had caused massive inflation, largely turning the urban population against him. Thankfully for Rhee, there was someone willing to provide financial aid, Uncle Sam and the good old US of A. Washington was willing to subsidize countries that stood on the front lines of the Cold War. The Republic of Korea and the 600,000-strong ROK Army were the bulwark that protected American interests in the area, as well as the disarmed Japan. Syngman Rhee was very aware of South Korea's geostrategic importance to the United States and had no moral inhibitions in accepting every last dollar the American government was willing to throw at him. In fact, for almost a decade, nearly the...
This is the worst aspect of, like, American development. Marshall Plan alike, we only fucking give free money to countries as long as they're violent, rabid, fascist dogs that squash any semblance of, like, socialism that exists in your society. And it's so fucking annoying because America could have done this across the board and put forth a century of cooperation. But the issue then obviously would be that, you know, inevitably people will be like, I don't want to do this capitalism shit. Also, it's not really free money either. You're right. At least with the World Bank and the IMF, the money goes directly back to foreign investors, or the money is given to the countries, and the countries can only use it on foreign investment or foreign companies coming in. Oftentimes with a direct interest in privatizing whatever remaining public sector resources.
The entire government budget came from American funding. With corruption being widespread, it's of little wonder that large amounts of these dollars ended up in the pockets of people working under Rhee, like cabinet officials and his political friends. Rhee's maladministration didn't go unnoticed, and his years from 1953 to 1960 can be summarized as an increasingly desperate attempt to cling to power. In the election for the National Assembly held in 1954, he managed to receive an absolute majority, but only by using police harassment and restrictive electoral laws. And he didn't stop there. Through the clever use of good old bribery, he managed to get many independent members of the Assembly onto his side, a move he needed to get the necessary two-thirds majority for a constitutional amendment that would allow for a third presidential term in 1956, which, of course, he got. However, the political mindset of the people had begun to change. People had had enough of the economic hardships, the out-of-control inflation, the corruption, and Rhee's authoritarian rule. His popularity declined rapidly in urban areas, and especially among the younger generations that tended to be better educated and thus had greater political understanding and stronger beliefs in democratic values and ideals. Facing the prospect of getting voted out of power, Rhee's administration resorted again to repression. A notable victim was Cho Bong-am, a former minister of Riis who made the simple mistake of founding his own party and obtaining an impressive 30% of the vote for the presidency in the 1956 elections. So, in February 1958, just a couple of months before the next assembly elections, he was charged with spying for North Korea and, after 2 trials, was executed in the summer of the following year. But even with the extensive repressions and electoral fraud, Ri's Liberal Party managed to only get 38.7% of the votes, compared to the Democratic Party, which won 29.5%. Ri responded to this stronger opposition the only way he knew how, with even stronger repressions. This culminated in the passage of a new national security law on Christmas Eve 1958. An attempt by the opposition to boycott the procedure was made in vain as the government mobilized the police and kicked them out of the building, then, unopposed, passed 22 bills, including the law that effectively turned South Korea into a police state. Under these new laws, criticizing the president was a crime, and intelligence agencies could arrest civilians merely on the suspicion of criminal activity. Ultimately, however, Ri's electoral frauds would become his own undoing. In the presidential election of 1960, he was unopposed at the ballots as his rival had passed away from cancer. But not to be satisfied with only one victory, his government also heavily rigged the elections for the vice presidency, an act which very soon came to light and resulted in massive protests. On April 19th, thousands of university students marched towards the presidential residence, demanding Syngman Rhee's resignation and new elections. In an effort to suppress the protests, the police mercilessly fired into the crowds, killing more than 100 students. This, however, failed in its goal.
I'm so confused. Why is America... Oh, that's right. This is... Oh, that's right. They already fucking destroyed North Korea in this process, and also offered logistical support to the incredibly violent ways in which the South Korean leadership had suppressed prior uprisings. So I guess the United States of America doesn't really care, it seems. I mean, it seems like they don't care that the government that they are that they've designed to have rulership over the wonderful nation of South Korea, a nation that they also designed by partitioning Korea, is doing this to its own citizens.
Goal to disperse the demonstrations, and over the following days, more and more people joined the protests. Facing overwhelmingly larger crowds, this time the armed forces refused to open fire, and on the 26th of April, Rhee submitted his resignation. 2 days later, he was flown out of the country on a DC-4 belonging to the CIA, and would spend the rest of his days in exile in Hawaii. Now, following Rhee's resignation, South Korea had the chance to implement a democratic system. To help achieve this, Ho Chung, the Minister of Foreign Affairs under the Rhee administration, was tasked with forming a caretaker government that would revise the constitution and organize new elections. The amended constitution designated the Second Republic to have a parliamentary cabinet system instead of a presidential one, which is the first and only time such a government system has been implemented in the history of Korea. In the National Assembly, elections were held in late July. The Democratic Party triumphed, whereas Rhee's former party, the Liberal Party, only managed to obtain 2 seats. It didn't take long, however, for cracks to appear within the Democratic Party. While they had been united against their common foe, Syngman Rhee, with him gone, the party split into 2 factions. This political infighting, coupled with inexperience in governance, created a politically unstable environment that couldn't fight the corruption or fix the ruined economy Rhee's administration had left behind, although they did formulate a 5-year plan. And the troubles for the vulnerable Second Republic didn't stop there. The students, emboldened by their successes against Rhee's regime, frequently protested.
Chatter that said, the more I learn about the United States' history and involvement in global affairs, the more I am confused as to why we didn't side with the Nazis. Was it just FDR? And the answer is both yes and no. The answer is yes for the most part. He had a lot of smoke in general. Okay, he had a lot of smoke in general for Nazis, for sure. Uniquely had a lot of smoke. But also at the time, at least like leading to the popularity of FDR, there was a lot more labor militancy. There was a lot more open socialism in the United States of America, something that is like impossible to contend with. Pearl Harbor was the straw that broke the camel's back. But I want to point to something else in American history, because we were pretty fucking close to aligning ourselves, or had aligned ourselves economically with Germany already. It's called the business plot. If the business plot had been successful, I think that America would have signed off on, I think America would have aligned itself with Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. So yeah, he didn't have to smoke because of the Holocaust though. Yeah, but to be fair to FDR, many people did not understand the true severity of the Holocaust until after they had successfully fought against Nazi Germany. Like, you have to remember, information was infinitely more limited at the time. Like, I don't know if America would care or be agitated, especially considering that there were Jewish refugees that were escaping, and we turned them around. But they quite literally did not have internet. Not to sound like Young Thug talking about James Harden wearing a Blue Lives Matter gator, but like, they didn't have internet at the time. And a lot of the information that came out about the camps were directly propagandized by the Nazi government. There's a big part of guys, stop focusing on the James Harden joke that I made, okay? Like, the Red Cross, as we understand it, is not exactly an infallible institution to begin with, even in contemporary society. But the Red Cross at the time aided and abetted in lying about the concentration camp. There was great progressive leaders in the FDR and eminent in public life. His vice president was Henry Wallace, who was friendly to the Soviet. FDR once said he would not rerun if the DNC didn't put him on the ticket. Sadly, in his final rerun, he was too weak, and the DNC bosses placed their own people to have Truman as the VP and thus becoming president. Yeah. Theresienstadt ghetto and the Red Cross. It was used as a model ghetto for deceiving International Committee of the Red Cross representatives about the ongoing Holocaust and the Nazi plan to murder all Jews. The Nazified German Red Cross visited the ghetto in 1943 and filed the only accurate report on the ghetto describing overcrowding and undernourishment. In 1944, the ghetto was beautified in preparation for a delegation from the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Danish government. Well, during the war in 1942, there was a Polish captain who snuck into the concentration camp and was there for 2 years, I think. He leaked info to the British, and the UK military dismissed the reports as outlandish because they didn't want to believe the reports were accurate. Now, what's really interesting about that is, think about it this way. We have direct insight into the everyday existence of Palestinians living in Gaza, and there's a current genocide happening in Gaza, okay? There's a current genocide happening in Gaza. We have direct insight. We have real-time coverage. And yet there are still a non-insignificant percentage of the public that turns a blind eye to it, or even recognizes the atrocities and says, no, it's good, we want more of it. So, and regardless of the people's opinion on the genocide in Gaza, no changes take place. So, like, imagine, even with the incredible amount of information that we can get nowadays, where you can directly talk to a person that is currently under occupation, that can die at any moment, still doesn't, it still does not matter. People still do not change their opinions on it. So I don't think that the Holocaust in and of itself was, it was not a important factor in the Allied forces